So Shari has joined me today. We had a couple of our contributors that were unable to make it today for various conflicts. But we're going to go ahead and soldier on without them as we continue our series on Meditations of the Tarot. This time we're talking about chapter 4, which is on the Emperor.
Yeah,
Um,
good one.
and Shari, do you have any suggestions as like where you'd like to start and dive into this one? There's something that you'd like to bring up right off the bat? I have an inclination to think that maybe we should talk about the description of the card itself to start.
Yeah. Should I show everybody the picture
Sure, go for it.
just so they can see? Let me see. There.
Right. So that's the image.
Yeah.
And like for understanding what he's talking about here, I mean, he always talks about like he always works from the image
Yeah.
to the symbol. But I think for some reason it felt like to me that that was particularly important in this instance.
Yeah. Well, when you said jump in, I was thinking I was thinking the same thing, to talk about the actual symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
And the first chapter is always kind of good. I mean, the first paragraph of the letter is always kind of,
A really good summary.
introductory. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I could read the first.
Yeah, I'm
paragraph.
thinking this is one where we might actually want to read. I'm thinking if we could read the actual like part, the early part where it actually talks about the imagery of the card, we might actually want to read it this time. And I
Sure.
don't know if you wanted to take turns or if you felt like just reading it.
Yeah.
It looks like it starts on page, looks like the actual description of the imagery of the card starts on page 78.
Yeah, I have it underlined actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Where
let
I
me.
write starting with, I think like, yeah. Let's see. I think really starting with the observation that the emperor has no weapons.
Which
It's on
is.
page 78. The card teaches us in the first instance that the
Yeah,
emperor
that's
has
the one.
renounced compulsion and violence. He has no weapons.
Yeah. 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 And then let me just read this first paragraph, because I think this is interesting.
Go for it.
Dear unknown friend, the less superficial a person is, and the more he knows and is capable of, the greater is his authority. I mean, when I read this, I was thinking about when Jesus spoke and they said he speaks as one with authority.
Right.
And
Yep.
what that means.
That immediately came to mind too. And I'm
Yeah.
always, because of my Christian anarchism makes me inclined to do this anyway, but I'm always making this distinction between power and authority,
Yeah. Yeah.
which Tomberg does better than I ever have in this chapter. Like
Yeah.
this is the clearest explanation of the principle of authority that I've ever read. And it
Yeah.
actually just made me like more certain of my convictions in the process,
Well,
which I had
it's
been wavering on lately, actually. And then Tomberg is like kind of reminded me of like, no, this is why you think that.
right.
So,
Well, that's because he's working from an image.
right,
That's why it's such a good explanation, right?
right.
But anyway, I'll just continue on. It's only a few
Please do.
sentences here. To be, in italics, something, to know, in italics, something, and to be capable of, in italics, something, is what endows a person with authority. One can also say that a person has authority in proportion to what he unites within himself of the profundity of mysticism, the direct wisdom of gnosis, and a productive power of magic. And just to reiterate, magic is when something is birthed into the world. That's how I look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Whosoever has this to a still higher degree can lay down, quote unquote, lay down the law. So there's that. That's the introduction. So it's it's kind of like a combination of to be something, to know something, and to be capable of something. And if you think about that in terms of like a job or a calling, let's say you're a pastor and you go to seminary and then you pastor for 25 years, right? Someone like Paul Vanderklay, for example,
Mhm.
then they can speak with authority. And Paul does actually, because people listen, right?
Mhm.
So that combination kind of is Tom Berg's recipe for authority. And then the paragraph that you were talking about, I'll just start with the one above it. The implication here is that the human bearer of true authority does not replace divine authority, but on the contrary, cedes his place to it. He has to renounce something to this end. The card teaches us in the first instance that the emperor has renounced compulsion and violence. He has no weapons. His right hand holds the scepter forward on which his gaze is fixed, and his left hand holds his tightly fastened belt. He is neither standing nor sitting. He is simply leaning back against a lowered throne and has only one foot placed on the ground. His legs are crossed. The shield adorned with an eagle rests on the ground at his side. Lastly, he is wearing a large and heavy crown. Should I go on?
Yeah, you can keep going a little bit further. I think this is important in this instance to actually describe the card.
The context of the card expresses active renunciation rather than the renunciation of constraint alone. The emperor has renounced ease, being not seated. He has renounced walking, being in a leaning position and having his legs crossed. He may neither advance in order to take the offensive, nor move back in order to retreat. His station is by his seat and his coat of arms. He is on sentry duty, and as such, he does not have freedom of movement. He is a guardian bound to his post. What he guards is fundamentally the scepter. Now, the scepter is not an implement with which one is empowered to do something or other. It is, from a practical point of view, a symbol serving nothing. The emperor has therefore renounced all action, having pledged his right hand to the scepter that he holds before him, whereas his left hand holds his fastened belt. It is no longer free because the emperor restrains himself with it. It serves the function of holding the impulsive and instinctive nature of the emperor in check, so that it does not intervene and divert him from his post as guardian. The emperor has therefore renounced movement by means of his legs and action by means of his arms. At the same time, he wears a large and heavy crown, and we have already meditated on the meaning of the crown with regard to that of the empress, which has a double meaning. It is the sign of legitimacy on the one hand, but it is also the sign of a task or a mission by which the crown is charged from above. Thus, every crown is essentially a crown of thorns. Not only is it heavy, but also it calls for a painful restraint with regard to the thought and free or arbitrary imagination of the personality. It certainly emits rays outwards, but these same rays become thorns for the personality within. They play the role of nails, piercing and crucifying each thought or image of the personal imagination. Here, true thought receives confirmation and subsequent illumination. False or irrelevant thought is riveted and reduced to impotence. The crown of the emperor signifies the renunciation of freedom of intellectual movement, just as his arms and legs signify his renunciation of freedom of action and movement. He is deprived of the three so-called natural liberties of the human being, those of opinion, word, and movement. Authority demands this. But this is not all. The shield bearing an eagle rests on the ground at his side. The emperor does not hold it with his hand, as the empress does. The shield is certainly there, but it belongs rather to the throne than to the person of the emperor. This means to say that the purpose for which the emperor is on sentry duty is not his, but that of the throne. The emperor does not have a mission. He has renounced this in favor of the throne, or in esoteric terms, he has no name. He is anonymous because the name, the mission, belongs to the throne. He is not there in his own name, but rather in the name of the throne. This is the fourth renunciation of the emperor, the renunciation of a personal mission or a name in the esoteric meaning of the word. Should I
Thank you.
continue?
I think that's, I think that's good. I think that gets most of it. Like the key concept is so that a lot of this has to do with renunciation.
Right. And I do want to talk about that next paragraph as well at some point. We don't have to now, but we can continue talking about that symbolism of the card.
And I think naturally that kind of leads us to, because he roots authority in this idea of renunciation, because effectively you're like, you're standing in the divine name rather than as a representative of yourself. Like there's like, it's like, there's a, you're beyond the concerns of the ego within the context of this card, right?
Yeah,
You're renouncing all of those things.
Yeah, you've given up opinion, word, and movement.
So this, I think, ties naturally to the parts where he talks about Simsum, the divine
Yeah.
retraction and crucifixion.
Yeah. I mean, that
Um,
comes a little bit later.
it does, but I think those are very connected. So I think in light of that, I'm trying to find, let's see, there's this is actually, this isn't quite there yet, but this is still ties of the authority to God. God governs the world by authority. This is on page 80, middle of the page. God
Yeah.
governs the world by authority and not by force. If this were not so, there would be neither freedom nor law in the world. And the first three petitions of the Lord's Prayer, Sanctificator nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in caelo et in terra, would lose all meaning. He prays these petitions, does so solely with the purpose of affirming and increasing divine authority and not divine power. The God who is almighty, not virtually but actually, has no need at all to be petitioned, that his reign may come and that his will may be done. The
Mhm.
meaning of this prayer is that God is powerful only insofar as his authority is freely recognized and accepted. Prayer is the act of such recognition and acceptance. One
Yeah.
is free to be believing or unbelieving. Nothing and no one can compel us to have faith. No scientific discovery, no logical argument, no physical torture can force us to believe, i.e., to freely recognize and accept the authority of God. But on the other hand, once this authority is recognized and accepted, the powerless becomes powerful. Then divine power can manifest itself. And this is why it is said that a grain of faith is sufficient to move mountains. Okay, and then a little bit further down, skipping a paragraph, and then the Christian world worships the crucifix, i.e., the image expressing the paradox of Almighty God reduced to a state of extreme powerlessness. And it is in this paradox that one sees the highest revelation of the divine in the whole history of mankind. One sees there the most perfect revelation of the God of love. The Christian creed says, for our sake he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered death and was buried. And I do want to get to the part about crucifixion and Simsum. Did you happen to find that yet?
Well, he gets to the Tsinsum on the next a little ways. Let us turn now to the idea of Tzimtzum, that part.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
The withdrawal of God, of the Lurianic school of Kabbalah. The doctrine of Tzimtzum reveals one of three mysteries in the Kabbalah. Sod Hazichut, the mystery of union. Sod Hatzimtzum, the mystery of concentration or divine withdrawal. Sod Hagilgul, the mystery of reincarnation or the revolution of souls. The two other mysteries, the mystery of union and that of the revolution of souls, will be treated later in the other letters, letter 10, for example. Concerning the mystery of the divine withdrawal or concentration, which interests us here, it is a question of the thesis that the existence of the universe is rendered possible by the act of contraction of God within himself. God made a place for the world in abandoning a region interior to himself. And then he quotes from Gershom Scholem, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. The first act of Ein Sof, the infinite being, is therefore not a step outside, but a step inside, a movement of recoil, of falling back upon oneself, of withdrawing into oneself. Instead of emanation, we have the opposite, contraction. The first act of all is not an act of revelation, but one of limitation. Only in the second act does God send out a ray of his light and begin his revelation, or rather his unfolding as God, the creator, in the primordial space of his own creation. More than that, every new act of emanation and manifestation is preceded by one of concentration and retraction. In other words, in order to create the world ex nihilo, God had first to bring the void itself into existence. He had to withdraw within in order to create a mystical space, a space without his presence, and the void. And it is in thinking this thought that we assist at the birth of freedom. For as Berdyaev has formulated it, freedom is not determined by God, it is part of the nothing out of which God created the world. You want me to go on?
Yeah, if you want to, go for
The
it.
void, the mystical space from which God withdrew himself through his act of tzimtzum, is the place of origin and freedom, i.e. the place of origin of an existence, which is absolute potentiality, not in any way determined. And all of the beings of the 10 created hierarchies, are the children of God and freedom, born of divine plenitude and the void. They carry within themselves a drop of the void and a spark of God. Their existence, their freedom, is the void within them. Their essence, their spark of love, is the divine blood within them. That reminded me of Douglas Harding, that sentence. They are immortal because the void is indestructible, and the monad proceeding from God is also indestructible. Further, these two indestructible elements, the meonic element, void, and the pleromic element, plenitude, are indissolubly bound to one another. The idea of tzimtzum, the withdrawal of God in order to create freedom, and that of divine crucifixion on account of freedom, are in complete accordance. For the withdrawal of God in order to make a space for freedom and his renunciation of the use of his power against the abuse of freedom within determined limits are only two aspects of the same idea. It goes without saying that the idea of tzimtzum and that of divine crucifixion is inapplicable when God is conceived of in the sense of pantheism. Pantheism, like materialism, does not admit the real existence of individual beings. Therefore, the fact of freedom, not merely apparent freedom, is excluded. For pantheism and for materialism, there is no question, and cannot be, of a divine withdrawal or a divine crucifixion. On the other hand, the Kabbalistic doctrine of tzimtzum is the only serious explanation that I know of concerning creation ex nihilo, which is of a kind to act as a counterbalance to pure and simple pantheism. Moreover, it constitutes a deep link between the Old and New Testament in bringing to light the cosmic significance of the idea of sacrifice.
Yeah.
Should I maybe just...
There's actually, I think, because I'd like, go ahead and read the next paragraph because it ties it back to the symbolism of the emperor. Yeah.
Now, the reflection of the idea of divine withdrawal and divine crucifixion is found to be indicated, as we have seen, in the fourth arcanum of the tarot, the emperor. The emperor reigns by pure authority. He reigns over free beings, i.e., not by means of the sword, but by means of the scepter. The scepter itself bears a globe with a cross above. The scepter therefore expresses in as clear as possible a manner the central idea of the arcanum, just as the world, the globe, is ruled by the cross. So is the power of the emperor over the terrestrial globe subject to the sign of the cross. The power of the emperor reflects divine power, and just as the latter is affected by divine contraction, tzimtzum, and by voluntary divine powerlessness, crucifixion, so the power of the emperor is affected by the contraction of his personal forces, the belt drawn tight by the emperor, and by voluntary immobility, the crossed legs of the emperor, at his post, the seat or throne of the emperor. Good.
Yeah, very good. So any thoughts? There's something I want to get to talking about, but I think what occurs to me is that this is telling you a lot about what the nature of the divine hierarchy is.
Yeah.
And how much it is rooted in these principles of love and freedom,
Yeah.
and not of power. That
Yeah. Well,
the divine authority is actually it is intrinsically connected to these principles of love and freedom.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
And
Well, he
that love
says,
is inherently kenotic, which is like that is the divine retraction, the simsum.
yeah.
Which is crucifixion as a symbol of the same thing.
Well, Jesus actually says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Right.
Right.
There's a withdrawal right within the
Withdrawal.
crucifixion.
Right. Right.
Itself.
Right. Right. And I
And,
would say, and I think the reason for that withdrawal is specifically for the is for the elevation of our humanity through him.
well, that's how I'm going to steal Jess's thing. That's how
Right.
things are made.
Yes, that's right.
That's how things are
That's
created.
how real things are made.
Real things.
That's how
right.
real things are made.
Yeah. Or how things are made real.
Well, he ties, like, I don't know if we actually want to quote from that section, but the way in which he ties freedom
I know, I'm
to
looking for it right
existence
now.
itself
Yeah.
is just so perfect.
Oh, maybe this.
Okay, go
I'm not
for it.
sure if this is it. I'm not. When I start reading, tell me if I'm in the wrong place, but because I'm looking for that right now. That
Honestly, there is no prayer. We could read the whole chapter out loud and no one would be the worse for it. It's very good.
So he says here, just trying to find out where to read from.
I had a really hard time figuring out what not to highlight.
I know.
But have you found it yet?
Yeah, no, that's not what no, I just read it and it's absolutely not what I was looking for. I'll have to keep looking. I'll keep looking.
Okay. Well, let's just talk about while you keep looking for that, and I'll talk about the part where he brings this into, like, the part that I read in the Voxer, where he just basically brings us into the theological realm and basically just nukes Reformed theology from orbit.
Okay. You want to hit that one right away?
So let's see here. I think it's
Page
actually
82.
I think it might be actually before that part.
Yeah, it's page 82.
Oh, page 82. Thank you.
Oh, wait,
Shari.
I found what I was looking for.
Okay, you read that first, and then we'll get into that. Yeah, you're right. Page 82, the worship, but yeah, about the worship of power.
Yeah. One understands this when one takes account of the significance of the fact of human freedom, and likewise the freedom of the beings of the spiritual hierarchies, the angels, archangels, principalities, powers, virtues, dominions, thrones, cherubim, and seraphim. All these beings, including man, the Isham, which I don't know what that is or Iskam, is that Jewish? Isham?
I don't know. I actually was meaning to look that up. Let
Okay.
me look it up really quick here. So I was actually looking at the translation of the portion of the Emerald Table that he didn't bother to translate.
Yeah,
Instead, I mean, my Latin is too rusty to get it exactly. I had the gist of it. I was pretty close, but let's see. How's that spelled?
ISCHIM.
ISCHIM.
Like, I'm wondering if it's Hebrew or if it's Yiddish, because ish is or to be in Low German. But anyway, might be Hebrew.
I'm only finding it as a medical term.
Oh, weird.
You said it's ISCHIUM? No,
I
it's not.
am. I
I
am.
am. Oh, I am.
Isham.
Oh, it auto. Oh, I had it right. It just didn't look up what I. It tried to find near matches. I don't know. It's too. Yeah, I
It's
don't
weird.
know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe if Joseph or Jacob listen to this, they could let us
Yep.
know. Because he's calling man the Isham, have an existence that is either real or illusionary. Or maybe no, all these beings, including man, the Isham,
Right.
have an existence that is either real or illusionary.
So he's putting that as he's proposing it's either it's real or it's illusionary.
Or it's illusionary, yeah.
Right.
If they have a real existence, if they are not a mirage, they are independent entities endowed not only with a phenomenal independence, but also a noumenal independence. Now, noumenal independence is what we understand by freedom. Freedom, in fact, is nothing other than the real and complete existence of being created by God. That was a really powerful sentence.
Yeah. So like being literally a free spirit, like in the literal sense, like we have like not just like in the colloquial way we say, oh, this person is a free spirit, but being a free spiritual being is that is the essence of what it means to be free.
Well, he clarifies it in the next sentence. He says,
right.
To be free and to exist are synonymous.
Synonymous. Right.
From a moral and spiritual point of view.
This is what I'm always, yeah, and this has always been my intuition. That's why I'm always saying that. This is why I argue with Luke so much about his determinism, because like to me, like this just like it's to make sense of anything, you have to understand metaphysically, to make sense of anything, you have to understand the complete radical freedom in which the world is actually created.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really exist otherwise. This is why I keep insisting on that.
Yeah. So then he goes on to say, just as morality would not exist without freedom, so would an unfree spiritual entity, soul or spirit, not exist for itself, but would be part of another spiritual entity which is free, i.e., which really exists. Freedom is the spiritual existence of beings. When we read in the scripture that God created all beings, the essential meaning here is that God has given freedom or existence to all beings. Freedom, once having been given, God does not take it back. This is why the beings of the 10 hierarchies mentioned above are immortal. Death, not separation from the body, but real death, would be the absolute deprivation of liberty, i.e., complete destruction of the existence given by God. But who or what can take the divine gift of freedom, the divine gift of existence from a being? Freedom, existence is inalienable. And the beings of the 10 hierarchies are immortal. The statement, freedom or existence is inalienable, can be understood as the highest gift, the very greatest value imaginable. Then this would be a foretaste of paradise, or as condemnation to perpetual existence. Then this would be a foretaste of hell. The perpetual existence would be a foretaste of hell.
Right.
Because no one sends us anywhere. Freedom is not being a theater. Freedom not being a theater, sorry. It is we ourselves who make the choice. Love existence, and you have chosen heaven.
To be or not to be.
And
that is the question.
And there you have chosen hell. And of course, immediately I thought about.
Think about that in light of what you were saying about the let it be yesterday, which was so on point.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why that is the ultimate affirmation.
That's the only way to be in the world.
That is the perfect relationship to God.
Yes.
Because it's nothing but let it be. It's like it's just taking pure joy in the fact that anything exists at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the glory and the miracle of it.
And you know, when I read that, love existence and you have chosen heaven, hate it, and there you have chosen hell, I thought immediately of the argument that Ivan Karamazov with Alyosha about pain and suffering in the world, and how, and especially on innocents, right, children, and how he just refuses to accept that. And a lot of people are stumped with that argument that Ivan makes, because he actually believes in God. He's not an atheist. Okay.
Right.
And this is the thing Dostoevsky sets up so well.
But the devils aren't atheists either,
Right. But
right?
the thing is, my conclusion to that, like I've been thinking about it for a long time, actually, because I'm like, what is actually going on there? Because Alyosha is dumb throughout the whole thing. He doesn't say anything, which is really important, actually. He feels compassion for his brother. That's given, right? That description is given in the story. And but Ivan is literally kicking at his own existence itself, right? By not accepting the suffering that he sees in the world that is unexplainable and cruel, and the most brutal suffering you can imagine. Like, the descriptions are horrible, right? Like a small child being abused by her parents, or babies being spiked on bayonets of Turkish soldiers. Like, this is these,
Right.
you just, how do you, right? And so,
But this is because of Ivan's idolatry ultimately, because he's, which is this actually, let's talk about this.
yeah, it's
Because
really,
Ivan, he believes in God, but essentially his theological conception is like the God of Calvin,
well,
a God who is responsible for everything that happens.
right. Like, I want to ask you this, because I don't know if I'm going to put it in the proper, vernacular here, but I'm going to just work with the words I have handy to my brain. To me, this is saying that you cannot approach God from a moral point of view. Like, right? Like, Ivan is really basically saying God is immoral.
Right.
This is immorality. If he's good and he exists, and I believe he does, then he must be immoral, because look at what he's letting happen. And so I
Right.
refuse.
Right. But he's letting happen.
Existence.
Like that's the key. This is the God of power, not the God of authority.
Right.
And just, which is a natural lead in to the part that I wanted to read next. Okay, here we go. The worship of the idol of power, um, conceived as the super. So basically, he talks about it in two ways. He talks about the worship of the idol of power as the idol of the idol of the Superman, and then the idol of the God who is almighty in the sense of power as opposed to authority. The worship of the idol of power, conceived of as the Superman, above all when one identifies oneself with it, is relatively inoffensive. So he's like, that is like the, honestly, it's far less bad, because it's basically, he says it, because being fundamentally infantile.
Yeah.
So you're just not a grown up.
Yeah.
But this is not so with the other category of power worshippers, namely those who project this ideal onto God himself. Their faith in God depends only on the power of God. This is Ivan, right? This is exactly right. If God was powerless, they would not believe in him. It is they who teach that God has created souls predestined to eternal damnation and others to predestined to salvation. The same would apply to God causing the suffering that is actually caused by our own actions.
Mm-hmm.
It is they who make God responsible for the entire history of the human race, including all its atrocities. God, they say, chastises his disobedient children by means of wars, revolutions, tyrannies, and other similar things. How could it be otherwise? God is almighty, therefore all that happens is only able to happen through his action or with his consent. The idol of power has such a hold on some human minds that they prefer a God who is a mixture of good and evil, provided that he is powerful, to a God of love who governs only by the intrinsic authority of the divine, by truth, beauty, and goodness, i.e., they prefer a God who is actually almighty to the crucified God.
Yeah. And there, I think this is important to read down a little, like,
Oh,
this
the prodigal
parable
son part? Yeah, go for it.
However, the father in the parable of the prodigal child had neither sent his son far from his paternal home in order to lead a life of debauchery, nor had he prevented him from leaving and forced him to lead a life which was pleasing to him, the father. All he did was to await his return and to go and meet him when the prodigal son was approaching his father's home. Everything which took place in the story of the prodigal son, save for his return to the Father, was clearly contrary to the will of the Father. Now, the history of the human race since the fall is that of the prodigal son. It is not a matter of the law of involution and evolution according to the divine plan of modern theosophists, but rather of an abuse of freedom similar to that of the prodigal son. And the key formula of the history of humanity is to be found neither in the progress of civilization, nor in the process of evolution, or in any other process, but rather in the parable of the prodigal son in the words, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." Is mankind therefore solely responsible for its history? Without a doubt, because it is not God who has willed it to be such. God is crucified in it.
Yeah, that line is so powerful.
Mhm. So, like, I'm personally having a little bit of difficulty, not that I don't agree, but I'm having a little bit of difficulty understanding where or how God's sovereignty works in light of what we just read.
Its sovereignty, his God's sovereignty is completed in love and freedom. That's
Right.
that is the divine hierarchy. That is the divine hierarchy. The hierarchy of power, as power, is the root of all idolatry and the basis of our system, the worldly system.
Okay, but then what do
This
you
is
do?
this.
What, like, with, because I don't want to separate the God of the Old Testament from the one of the New Testament.
I
Like,
don't
I
think
don't want to
this.
say that's the
Right.
old God. That's the one before he died on the cross. Now he's all.
I
Now
don't. I
he's
don't.
has,
I don't think it does. It
it
depends on
doesn't.
how you're. I don't think it does at all.
Like, I'd like to know where how it
Well,
he
because
does.
God of the Old Testament is a God of liberation too,
Okay.
right? He's the God who liberates. He's the God who liberates his people from Egypt. Like if you're reading these in this, if you're reading these books in a spiritual way,
Yeah.
they're conveying spiritual truths, and they're also showing a movement of, and they're actually showing the movement in terms of the operation of God in history toward our liberation
Yes.
progressively, right? Starting with the people of Israel, and then through the Messiah, all humanity.
Yeah.
It's a restoration of, because it's a restoration of our freedom. Because here's the thing. It's like we also make in addition to making an idol of power, we also make an idol of the freedom, which is the nothing, right? Which is the void. That's what nihilism is the worship of the void.
Right.
But that freedom without knowledge of its created of its creator's source also ends up enslaving us.
Say that again.
Sure. So he associates freedom with the void, right?
Yeah.
Right, with the nothing. It's pure potentiality by it's just all it is pure potentiality.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an intrinsic part of what we are, but it's not the only part, right? It's for Tomberg shows it's a combination of the void and the blood, right?
Yeah, I'm just looking at it here.
And the blood is that's the divine spark. So when we do nothing but when we stop caring about if we stop caring only about just potentiality and not God, which actuates that potentiality,
Yeah.
and we lose that balance between
Right.
these two polar things, and we go off pursuing only freedom, that's just as destructive. And ultimately we do it because of it. Ultimately it's secondary because we do it for power is why we do it. That's our motivation. Power is our motivation, and then it's an avoidance of authority.
The ultimate freedom, you mean pursuing this freedom to
Right.
Without the
Power,
balance.
desire for power is what motivates us to do that.
Okay, yeah,
Because there would be, well, because look at the emperor, right? The emperor, in order to become the figure of the emperor, which, I mean, like Talmberg in this text, like it makes it clear, it's like he upholds like the symbolic understanding of the emperor in the medieval Christian mind, but he makes it very, very clear that the potential to instantiate this idea of the emperor, like physically and imminently in our world, is now, it's bound to corruption and failure because it always ends up being done by the sword,
right,
right? And he gives examples of Napoleon and Hitler,
yeah, yeah,
right? So it now becomes, instead, the emperor becomes a symbol of the initiated.
yes,
So that is the one who has come to rest in the divine name
yeah,
through spiritual initiation.
yeah.
And that's but there's a whole bunch of limitation. There's a renunciation that requires renunciation.
Yeah, which is, okay, so let me just read this
So
really.
it's not, so that means that we have to give up, you have to give up on all that limitless potentiality
Yeah.
of the nothing, the void,
Mhm.
in order to bring up the blood.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about this because I know that in discussions, especially when it comes to discussions around universalism or apocatastasis,
Mm-hmm.
people who are more on the Calvinist, let's just keep it simple and say the Calvinist side of the argument, they immediately reach for the God of the Old Testament,
Right.
right?
But they're
And
understanding, but you don't need to the God of the Old Testament does not have to be understood in that way.
right, so he says here, I just want to read this paragraph because maybe you could just help me understand it better.
Okay.
It's on page 85 in the middle. It goes without saying that the idea of tzimtzum and that of divine crucifixion is inapplicable when God is conceived of in the sense of pantheism.
Right.
Pantheism, like materialism, does not admit the real existence of individual beings. Therefore, the fact of freedom, not merely apparent freedom, is excluded. For pantheism and for materialism, there is no question, and cannot be, of a divine withdrawal or a divine crucifixion. On the other hand, the Kabbalistic doctrine of tzimtzum is the only serious explanation that I know of concerning the creation of ex nihilo, which is of a kind to act as a counterbalance to pure and simple pantheism. Moreover, it constitutes a deep link between the Old and New Testament in bringing to light the cosmic significance of sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
So there, he sees a link through Kabbalah, through tzimtzum,
Mm-hmm.
and ex nihilo between the Old and the New Testament. So
Right.
can you illuminate that for me? Because I don't really.
Well, what he's saying is that, like, if you're reading, like, the Kabbalists are reading the Old Testament texts in a different way. They're reading them mystically.
Right.
So what he's saying is that in the mystical approach to the text, you see a harmony between the Old and the New Testament, and they both have, and that harmony
Is somewhere
is
found in ex nihilo.
right.
So where is it found in
The
ex nihilo?
creation out of nothing.
Is
The
this the
retraction, the divine retraction.
Okay, the
That's
withdrawal.
why, like, he's talking about Simsum and crucifixion, both involving the divine withdrawal.
Right. And
The
so how does
creation of a
that link?
space, the creation of a space that there may be something other than God.
Mhm.
And he contrasts it with pantheism. It's just like everything exists in
Everything is
God,
God.
is a part of God.
Yeah.
So therefore nothing exists except for God.
Yeah.
You have no real independent existence.
Yeah.
You're just one of infinite expressions of the divine that is,
Right.
simply is, right?
Yeah.
And in materialism, you're just saying there's no God. It's just nothing, and
It's
it's
just raw
and
material.
both are totally deterministic, by the way,
Yeah.
and couldn't be otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is no room for freedom.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's why
freedom,
sometimes.
so freedom and love are really the key to understanding what Tomberg is saying here.
And to be is to be free.
Right, and he specifically says about the crucifixion, where the like, so Simsum is the idea of the divine withdrawal, that something may exist other than God, right? Because God is ultimately, I would say, because from Christian revelation, because God is love, and this is necessary to even have a concept of love. There has to be something to be loved, right?
Well, this is what I think this is also what Viktor Frankl talks about, right? In his logotherapy, like to be is to be free. So he could speak to people in a concentration camp and tell them that they are not prisoners, but that they are free.
Right, that's right. That's right. Because this is, yes, because that's what, like, that's like the freedom of being you,
right,
is ultimately what freedom is.
Yeah.
And even if there are unimaginable constraints put upon you, that doesn't change that existential freedom. And that existential freedom is the only real freedom.
Yes, because he says to be, right? Where is that now? I don't know where I put it. Got all this stuff underlined. I can't find it. But anyways, to be is to be free. To exist is what does he say about?
Because you're not, I mean, like, necessarily so, right?
Freedom
because
and existence are synonymous.
if you're not free, you don't really exist.
Freedom and existence are synonymous, is what he says. Freedom is the spiritual existence of beings.
Right.
Yeah. So.
And in a way, and in some way, like, we're existing less in as much as we resist becoming truly human, which is theosis. In as much as we are resisting that, we are actually resisting
our own existence,
the fullness of our own being.
Yes. Well, this is what Ivan's doing.
Right. That's right.
His rejection is not of God, but of his own existence.
And he's refusing and he's refusing responsibility.
Yeah.
Right?
Because totally.
Right. And he's putting it all on God.
Yeah. He wants
God,
as opposed to
saints see, like, so many saints, like, see, like, the failings of things that they had nothing to do, like failures that they had nothing to do with. They see themselves as responsible for that. So, which is a complete exact opposite attitude of Yvonne, right? Like, as long as anything is wrong in the world, then they feel like a personal sense of responsibility. It's like kind of like the bodhisattva spirit of, like, until as long as there are, are people that are still struggling to and to see the real, I should keep returning and be reborn over and over again until all souls have been brought into the experience of the real.
Well, there's this really great story about, I can't remember who it is. And I wanted to look it up last night because I thought of it while I was reading this, of a saint whose brother was murdered, and he found the murderer in his barn, his brother's murder, and he knew apparently everyone knew who the guy was, right? But he acted as he fed the guy, okay? He looked after him, he gave him a warm place to sleep, and he let him go the next day.
Right.
Right. And I've thought about that story so many times because, oh my gosh, like, and I don't think the guy realized that the saint was the brother of the guy he murdered, okay?
Right.
And but the saint knew that he had murdered his brother. And so, I mean, this is the same as Christ standing before Pilate. Right. This is when Pilate says, are you going to defend yourself? And Christ says nothing. And then Pilate says, this is ecce homo, right? This is the true human being.
Right. And we can see, I mean, this chapter is like, it connects to so many things and so many problems we have. I mean, it becomes it becomes evident from this, like once you understand like what this principle of authority is actually rooted in,
Yeah,
like why it's impossible to actually like to baptize power,
right.
because it's just it's wrongheaded from the outset.
Well, I
This is
was,
why I would say like I suppose like I mean I describe myself as a Christian anarchist because none of the forms of all of the forms of rule that we have are all based on power in this world.
right.
All of them, 100%.
Yeah,
That's the
especially at the
that's
justice.
the hierarchy that they're respecting. That's what they're based on. That's why I am. Now, if I suppose like what I would accept as genuine is rule of the saints,
Mhm.
which have this kind of authority, right?
Well, the only kind of, well, anyway, I just wanted to read this quick quote from Goethe. I was digging into Goethe yesterday and the day before. And this gets to the idea of the story of the saint that I just told and his murdered brother. If you treat an individual as he is, he will remain how he is. But if you treat him as if he were what he ought to be and could be, he will become what he ought to be and could be.
Right. Yeah.
And this is the
Yes.
power of love,
Right. Right. Right.
right?
Right.
Is that it is enabling in the way in a proper way people to become.
And that's like the persuasion of love, you know, the I mean, the seduction really of it.
Yeah,
This is why, you know, God is portrayed as the desirous lover sometimes, right?
right. And then
Because
he says again,
that's how it does it. It doesn't need it doesn't you don't need compulsion.
no, you don't.
Like
Well,
if you're resorting to compulsion, you have no authority, and no one should respect you. Really,
Mhm,
honestly,
mhm,
like you're showing that you have no authority the minute you resort to compulsion.
right. Goethe also has another quote: "The way you see people is the way you treat them, and the way you treat them is what they become."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
have to see them as free and divine,
Right.
and if you see them that way, they will become that way.
Right.
Right. If
Right.
that's how you see them, you will treat them like that and they will become like that. Like
Right.
that is the power of love.
Right. Right. Which is indistinguishable from true authority.
Yeah. And also, I think you will speak as one with authority.
Right. Of course you will. Because we know it when we see it. That's why even when it makes no rational sense, it makes no rational sense according to the principles of our world
Right.
and to the and to the dominion of, you know, the principalities and powers and this corrupt hierarchy of power that we've established. Even when it makes no logical sense in accordance with those principles, we still see how compelling it is. So this is why we're grabbed when Jesus says love our enemies. This is why it grabs us and we know it's true,
Mm-hmm.
even though everything in the world tells us that's a bunch of rubbish, and that thinking that is a good way to get yourself killed or worse.
Well, what's interesting about this idea of authority for me is authority comes from above. Okay.
Yes.
This is what he says.
It's rooted in God. That's the
So
only source of
if you
authority.
stand before Pilate and you don't defend yourself, then you are literally transcending what's going on around you.
Yeah, he's refusing to acknowledge.
And
That's it.
to transcend something is to ascend, right?
Right.
To be above it.
Right. He is
And
above it.
so,
And that's why he's silent. That's why he doesn't, this is why he doesn't resist it. This
right.
is
But
why
what
he
my
says
point
resist
here
not
is,
evil.
it's interesting about how important these spatial ideas, the spatial elements of these
Yes.
ideas are, okay? Because we still
Yes.
today use the term look up to someone.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
We
Yes.
look up to people who we let have authority in our lives, okay? And And Tomberg says authority comes from above.
Right.
And what Christ did before Pilate, what Franz Jägerstätte did with the Nazis, right? People like this, Alyosha with Ivan, is they in their silence, they transcend. So they become someone to look up to, right? Like of someone who speaks with authority, even when they don't speak. Like,
right.
I'm really fascinated by, because I've been talking about images. So we have, and images are shapes, and shapes fill spaces, right? And we have all this spatial language when we talk about these things. We talk about transcendence, which is really something that is above us, right?
Right.
We talk about, what does God, what shape is God taken in the world? He's taken on the shape of man. What is incarnation? It's something filling a shape, Anyway, that's just what I've been thinking about a lot. And one of the things I found interesting in here, and it goes back a little bit from what we were talking about, but
It's fine. We can move about the text. That's fine.
Yeah. Is he talks about spaces. Okay, so where's that? First of all, he says on page 79, it is said that nature has a horror of emptiness. The spiritual counter-truth here is that the spirit has a horror of fullness. It is necessary to create a natural emptiness. And this is what renunciation achieves, in order for the spiritual to manifest itself. So the Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount state this fundamental truth. The first Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, means to say that those who are rich in spirit, who are filled with the spiritual kingdom of man, have no room for the kingdom of heaven. Revelation presupposes emptiness, space put at its disposal in order to manifest itself. This is why it is necessary to renounce personal opinion in order to receive the revelation of the truth, personal action in order to become an agent for sacred magic, the way of personal development in order to be guided by the master of ways, and one's personally chosen mission in order to be charged with a mission from above. This is why the emperor, he is emperor. This is why he is authority. He has made a place in himself for the divine name, which is the source of authority. He has renounced personal and intellectual initiative, and the emptiness which results is filled by divine initiative. Then he goes on to quote from the Tao Te Ching, which I'm going to read because it's
it's a great quote.
So
Go for it. Yeah.
30 spokes unite in one nave, and because of the part where nothing exists, we have the use of a carriage wheel. Clay is molded into vessels, and because of the space where nothing exists, we are able to use them as vessels. Doors and windows are cut out in the walls of a house, and because they are empty spaces, we are able to use them. Therefore, on the one hand, we have the benefit of existence, and on the other, we make use of non-existence. And again, be humble, and you will remain entire. Be bent, and you will remain straight. Be vacant, and you will remain full. Be worn, and you will remain new. He who has little will receive. He who has much will be embarrassed. Therefore, the sage keeps to one and becomes the standard for the world. He does not display himself, therefore he shines. He does not approve himself, therefore he is noted. He does not praise himself, therefore he has merit. He does not glory in himself, therefore he excels. And because he does not compete, therefore no one in the world can compete with him. So, I mean, in that quote from the Tao Te Ching, he talks about space, but he also talks about the coincidence of opposites.
About what? Yeah, right.
Coincidence of opposites, right?
Yeah.
Be bent and you will remain straight. Be vacant and you will remain full.
Right.
Anyway, I don't know. I'm still thinking about this whole idea of space, but I find it really interesting because
Well, that's
we talk about,
that's the principle of the conquest of death by death is based on that same concept.
yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, but here's the thing is like, we can actually this is something that's a principle that we can verify through our own experience. Like if we've
Of course.
anyone who's ever had an experience of anything that came to them that seemed like a real divine revelation or a word from God, whether it happened to you when, when in prayer, meditation, reading the scriptures, or even just like, you know, um, maybe reading some other kind of text and just like approaching the text in such a way that you weren't forcing your own ideas, right? And you were
Or
making
even
s-
just your,
you were making the space to allow a revelation to happen. Like that's the only way. Anytime you approach any of these things and it's just you're continuing to bring your own thoughts to it
yeah,
and you don't allow those to recede, then there's no
yeah.
possibility of the revelation ever coming to you.
Well, here he says on page 87, now the emperor on the fourth card is alone, without a court or retinue. His throne is in no way to be found in a room of the imperial palace, but rather in the open. In the
Yeah,
open,
right.
in an uncultivated field, not located in a town. A meager clump of grass by his foot is there as the whole imperial court, as all the witnesses of his imperial splendor. But the clear sky is spread above him. He is a silhouette on the background of the sky, alone in the presence of the sky. This is how the emperor is. One could ask, why is the astonishing fact that the emperor is found with his throne in the open air, under the starry sky, if you wish, overlooked by so many authors of the tarot? Why have they not stated the fact that the emperor is alone without a court or retinue? I believe that it is because it is rarely that one lets the symbol, the image of the symbol as such, say all that it has to say through its unique context. One lets it say a little, and one is suddenly more interested in one's own thoughts,
Right.
in what one has to say oneself, rather than what the symbol has to say. Yet the card is specific. The emperor is alone in open air in an uncultivated field with a tuft of grass as his only company. Save for the sky and the earth, the card teaches us the arcanum of the authority of the emperor, although it may be unrecognized, occult, unknown, and unappreciated. It is a matter of this crown, the scepter, the throne, and the coat of arms being guarded, without any witnesses other than the sky and the earth, by a solitary man leaning against the throne with his legs crossed, wearing a crown, holding the scepter and clasping his belt. It is authority as such, and it is the post of authority as such, which is expressed here. Authority is the magic of spiritual profundity filled with wisdom, or in other words, it is the result of magic based on gnosis due to mystical experience. So you cannot, like
Right,
that goes back to that first chapter, first paragraph that I read, where he
which
says,
he takes this, I mean, he takes this, the symbol of the emperor, right? He's at this point taking it completely out of its earthly domain, and you now see what the emperor truly is the one who is living in the kingdom. In fact, he specifically says for whom the present and eternity are joined. That's living
yeah,
in the kingdom.
right, which is an open space,
Right.
which is really interesting to me because
because
that's what I've
because
been
you're
talking
because
about
you have
recently.
right, because you have authority, you don't need to use compulsion or impact the freedom of anything else. You let it be.
Yeah,
Right.
but you also have to have this clearing, right? That the emperor finds himself in.
Right.
Like I wrote years ago in a blog that I used to do that, that I felt at the time that we needed to take a huge step back from everything that we know as Christians. And when I said it, this is like way before Jordan Peterson, all that, right? And I knew when I said it that would be next to impossible because we are steeped in it, right? Like
Right.
our culture is Christian. But I said as far back as you can possibly, like as if you're discovering God for the very first time. And so this is was my way of describing this open space, right? Something that is new that you have never encountered before. It's wide open. And I feel like he's talking about that when he describes where the emperor sits. He's not allowing anything to distort or cloud his reception to God or something like that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, no, very good.
Just like really hard to do.
Very hard to do. Very hard to do.
Really hard to do. Yeah.
That's why there are practices.
Yes, which he gets into.
We does. That's why I said that, because that's a transition to like I thought it was very interesting, especially since we did that. Our previous series was on a book that was on the Apocalypse of John. I wanted to get your take on what he says about
that was interesting to me.
The Apocalypse of John. I can go ahead and read that one since you've been letting me do a lot of the reading. Okay, here we go. This is on page 91. Thus, the key to the Apocalypse of St. John is nowhere to be found, for it is not at all a matter of interpreting it with a view of extracting a philosophical, metaphysical, or historical system. The key to the Apocalypse is to practice it, i.e., to make use of it as a book of spiritual exercises which awaken from sleep ever deeper layers of consciousness. The 7 letters to the churches, the 7 seals of the sealed book, the 7 trumpets and the 7 vials signify altogether a course of spiritual exercises composed of 28 exercises. For as the Apocalypse is a revelation put into writing, it is necessary in order to understand it to establish in oneself a state of consciousness which is suited to receive revelations. That is that openness, which that's why the emperor is in the open field, right? That's why the emperor has restrained and withdrawn so that he is internally open to receive that revelation. It is this state of concentration without effort taught by the first arcanum, followed by a vigilant inner silence taught by the second arcanum, which becomes an inspired activity of imagination and thought, where the conscious self acts together with superconsciousness, teaching of the third arcanum. Lastly, the conscious self halts its creative activity and contemplates in letting pass in review everything which preceded with a view to summarizing it, practical teaching of the fourth arcanum. The mastery of these 4 psychological operations symbolized by the magician, the high priestess, the empress, and the emperor is the key to the Apocalypse. One will search in vain for another. The Gospels likewise are spiritual exercises, i.e., one has not only to read and reread them, but also to plunge entirely into their element, to breathe their air, to participate as an eyewitness, as it were, in the events described there. And all this in not in a scrutinizing way, but as an admirer with ever-growing admiration. The Old Testament also contains parts which are spiritual exercises. The Jewish Kabbalists, the author or authors of the Zohar, for example, made such use of it. And it is thus that the Kabbalah originated, and that it lives. The difference between Kabbalists and the other faithful depends on the fact that the former drew spiritual exercises from Scripture, whilst the latter studied it and believed it. The aim of spiritual exercises is depth. It is necessary to become deep in order to be able to attain experience and knowledge of profound things. And it is symbolism, which is the language of depth. Thus, arcana, expressed by symbols, are both the means and the aim of spiritual exercises, of which the living tradition of Hermetic philosophy is composed. Spiritual exercises in common with the common exercises in common form the common link that unites Hermeticists. It is not knowledge in common which unites them, but rather the spiritual exercises and the experience which goes hand in hand with them. If 3 people from different countries were to meet each other, having made the Book of Genesis by Moses, the Gospel of St. John, and the Vision of Ezekiel the subject of spiritual exercises for many years, they would do so in brotherhood, although the one would know the history of humanity, The other would have the science of healing, and the third would make a profound Kabbalist. That which one knows is the result of personal experience and orientation, while its depth, the niveau to which one attains, disregarding the aspect and extent of knowledge that one has gained, is what one has in common. Hermeticism and Hermetic tradition is in the first place and above all a certain degree of depth, a certain niveau of consciousness, and that is the practice of spiritual exercise which safeguards this.
Right. Yeah, this is in that last bit there, he says, that which one knows is the result of personal experience and orientation, right?
Yeah.
Which has nothing to do with knowledge. It's to me, it's kind of like a form of understanding.
Right.
And then orientation he puts in there too, right? Which I find really interesting. Like I wrote something yesterday, I think it was yesterday, in the Voxer that I saved, because when I was reading through this, I thought, man, I'm talking about that here somehow. Open space, shape, clearing. This indicates to me that this is about incarnation. It's about a shape and image. An image is the particular constituted into a whole. It is again the problem of the one and the many, the head and the body. And this is in itself fractal. The head is the center of orientation, and orientation is necessary to find a place for the body. In the best case, a place of abundant life. Again, we are in a space or space, but we can only find it through orientation. We must be oriented to the Father, the giver of life, and we must begin to see the world as our community. I didn't want to read that, but John Bear makes the point that this is what makes Christ universal. He shared in one thing we all hold in common. It may sound simple and childlike, but it's always the only place I arrive at. We must turn our face away from the quagmire of particulars and orient ourselves to the Father, the one, the whole, and when we do, the body will follow. All the particulars will dissolve into the unity of the whole. This doesn't mean they will go away. It means they will no longer be problems to solve.
Right.
And
they'll be properly ordered in accordance with the principles of divine authority, which we've been talking about this whole time.
Right. And he says here in the little like these words are just jumping out at me off the page, right? Is orientation, place, space. And in the Tao Te Ching quote, he says, therefore the sage keeps to one, capital O, and becomes the standard for the world. This is the Hermeticist.
Right.
He does not display himself, therefore he shines. He does not approve himself, therefore he is noted. He does not praise himself, therefore he has merit. He does not glory in himself, therefore he excels. And because he does not compete, therefore no one in the world can compete with him. And it's so interesting because he talks about that as a Merkmal, as a something that an identifier of a Hermeticist is that they're in the background, right? That they're not up front, that they don't have, that they're okay with the doctor doing the healing and the scientist doing the discoveries. And you remember that chapter? I think it was the second letter or something.
Right.
And anyway, I'm making really disjointed connections here. But.
No, but this is thing though. But you're talking. This is important, and I think you're the right person for me to be talking to about this, because you're always bringing things back to this idea of space and openness. And if you look back to when we were talking about the Apocalypse of John by M.L. Bach, there was the part where he was talking about the Parsifal, right? And he was talking about like the place where time becomes space.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is which I think this is connected to like this idea of the now. This is, I think, the place where the now touches eternity, the idea of eternity, because
Yes, it
the
does.
because really what the eternity is the expanded now, the open now, right? The kind of like,
Yeah, where the emperor's sitting.
correct, exactly, where the emperor is sitting. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and what we see, and if you look at the apocalypse, what happens in the apocalypse is you're seeing what's going on in our cycles, which is that time continues to press and press and press, and basically to lose, we lose space. The more time compresses, the more time becomes central to us, and the less we lose space. You can also see this in Harding's cycles of life, right?
Yeah.
In the beginning, in your childhood, you're
Yeah.
open, right? Space is more important to you than time. You have almost very little conception of time as a child.
Yeah. You have very little conception of time. Yeah.
Right, right. And as you age and mature, and you go through these cycles, time becomes more and more of a
Well,
concern
they
for
become
you.
differentiated too. I'm just thinking about it because
Right,
time time is, when you're a child, time is a space. You
right,
you learn you learn that, if you can say, like, watch this show for 15 minutes, that's a space which you inhabit for 15 minutes, right? Or you can play by the creek for half an hour. Now you have time is and space are almost the same, I think, when you're a child, right? And as you get older, they become differentiated, where you think, well, I don't have enough time to go to that space.
right. And our concern. There's something to me. I've always had this, and I don't think this is actually one thing that I kind of like. I think the first time I don't. This is an intuition I'd always had. I think the first time I ever read anything that kind of aligned with this was when I first read Heidegger in my 20s, and I was reading Being and Time. And so Heidegger seems to share the same intuition. So this is one area where I would say
Because,
Heidegger might be onto something, is that like there's a way in which the time is connected to fall.
yeah,
And as the state of our fallenness becomes more advanced, the more time seems to crowd out space.
yeah,
Whereas the movement toward eternity we have to find it in the now, because that is the place where eternity touches.
yeah.
And the
There's a
more open
physicist.
we can make that experience of the now, the more we can approach it with openness and not demand anything of it, but allow it reveal itself to us. This is
Right.
why he keeps talking about revelation, right?
Yeah.
Revelation is like allowing something to be effectively, and
Yeah. And
not
it's
trying to alter it or make it exist on your terms, but let it be as it is,
right.
and allow yourself to be in the same way, which we're taught, we're struggling with that all the time.
Yeah.
How many of us are able to truly live as our authentic selves in a meaningful, like, deep way? That's not just some
Yeah. Without
superficial.
regret.
Almost always our
Without
idea of being
regret.
our authentic selves is wearing some sort of mask, really. It's like, oh, I'm
Yeah,
this
because we
is
don't. This is another Goethe quote. I absolutely
okay.
have to read in light of that.
Okay, go
because
for it.
I say this all the time. This is my whole "you have to love yourself" thing, right?
Yeah,
Um, let me just go out of here and see if I can see it. As soon as you trust yourself, you will know how to live.
right.
And the greatest evil that can befall man is that he should come to think ill of himself. So this is why I think, and I mean, those things just resonate. That's why I saved them, because I'm just like, yeah,
if you think well of yourself and you love yourself, are you going to have a wretched attitude toward
Well, we
existence?
think narcissism or psychopathy or something. That's what we think about. We just go straight to the worst case scenario, which is so
Right,
rare, right?
right.
I mean, how could
But
that saint?
narcissism isn't really a proper self-love though. It's the thing though. Like
No, it's a
narcissism is an
falling in love with
obsession with the,
yourself.
it's the reflection or the shadow.
It's the falling in love with yourself, not
Well, but
loving
not even
yourself.
the real self though, but it's a reflection or a shadow. It's not really the real
Yeah,
self.
yeah. But I think the key
Right.
is, yeah, anyway, like that saint that fed and clothed and housed the murderer of his brother and said nothing and let him go couldn't have done that if he didn't know himself, if he didn't trust
Right.
himself.
Right.
There's no way he could have done that. No way in hell. Okay.
Right.
It's not possible.
Right.
He also couldn't have thought ill of himself. He
Right.
couldn't let regret and guilt and shame and all those things overwhelm him. I mean, those things are there for a reason, right? To propel us into more holiness. And he understood that. But the only reason he understood that was because he trusted himself and he saw himself, right, as what he was becoming and not what he was. And this goes back to Douglas Harding. You are not what you look like, because what you look like is death. Okay. And when you think that that's what you
Because
are,
it's passing
then
away. It's constantly
that is hell.
changing and
Right.
degrading.
What you are is eternal, right? What you look like is death. So there has to be this metanoia, right? Jesus says you have to be born again. Hello.
Yeah.
About this, because once you do that, then you are in that open space and you can have revelation. Revelation is from above. It comes to you, right? You don't, like he says earlier in there, you don't call down God. And how many Christians have I met who do that? They call down God. I'm just like, no, you don't do that.
Right.
God
And
is
when they're doing that,
everywhere.
they're actually, believe it or not, they're actually, so I'm going to say something that's fairly
Yeah, do
radical,
it.
but they're
Yeah.
no different than Yvonne.
No.
They really aren't. Their God
And
is the
they're also
same.
practicing
You know
sorcery.
what though? I would say actually Yvonne is actually probably in a better moral state than the person who wants to call down God as their
Well, he's
personal
not deceived
plaything
that
in
he
that
can do
way.
that.
Because Yvonne has a greater heart for the suffering of others.
He's also not deceived that he can
Right.
do that. He realizes that what Yvonne refuses to do is reconcile the good, benevolent father with the pain and suffering of the world.
Right.
That's what he's refusing. He doesn't want those two to touch.
Because he's ultimately refusing his own responsibility for it.
That's right. That's his existence. His existence,
Right.
he's refusing. Right. That's
Right.
how I.
Because we can't like that. We can't bear our responsibility for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is like, I suppose, like that's the good part of Calvinism.
Well, see,
Right.
the thing is, then there's Alyosha. I mean, Alyosha's moving in and out of all this chaos in the book, right? All these people are suffering, basically. So he's moving in and out of suffering. And he's just some people might think he's stupid, he's naive, he's dumb, he's callous. Because he doesn't jump in, he's not saving the day, he's not declaring anything about it. He's just being there. Right, which would be Heideggerian in a sense, right? It would also be what Tomberg is talking about, right? He's inhabiting a space, Alyosha, and because he's transcended, he speaks as one who has authority, right?
Right.
People want to hear what Alyosha has to say, but what does Alyosha
We always
actually do?
We always do. Like we always do. That's the thing.
Yeah.
This is why I don't understand. I really, really fundamentally do not understand people who desire to wield power for the sake of wielding power. And they're so transparent to me.
Well, I think it's because they think they can fix something. Like, you know me, I've been harping on this stop fixing things for a long time.
Yeah,
And that
yeah,
that is why people, it's a leaning towards the good, right? They think that if they can grab a hold of something, some tool, that they can fix a problem, right?
right,
Sam Harris is doing that. That's what Sam Harris is doing.
right.
I think that's what John Vervaeke is doing actually too. And that makes me nervous about his project, because I don't think you can fix something. This is the whole thing that I'm realizing about space,
Is
is
he,
that
what do you
it's
think
where
that
you go
John
to
is trying, what
explore
do you think that John is trying to fix? I think
the
he's
meaning
trying to, I
process.
think that John is actually exercising genuine authority, in my experience. And he's actually using it to, in fact, he has the authority of the, like, he talks about like how like the authority, what the authority is, the authority to found a school. I think that's essentially what John has done, right? John has used the authority he has to found his school, which is why he has so many people listening to him and to his ideas.
Yep.
And they're finding something there. He's actually
Yeah.
enhancing the freedom of the people that
Yes.
are listening to him.
Yeah.
And in as much as he's doing that, he's operating in accordance with these principles. Not doing it perfectly, maybe, but neither am I. So I don't want to
No.
criticize him too much. And I have a great deal of respect for John. So
Well, I do too. Like,
yeah,
my saying that he's trying to fix something is not a sign of disrespect at all, or doesn't negate what he's doing. But there is something about, like, there's exploration. There's a difference between exploring something for the sake of exploring it, because this is the let it be. This goes back for me to the let it be, right? Where, and
I want to. This is really interesting, and I want to let's get into this. And I like where this is going, because how do we apply this like right now, where
right,
like the world seems to be falling apart and so many things seem to need fixing. Like,
right, and people are scrambling to do
how do
that.
we find the strength? And is it really wisdom to not, is it really in fact wisdom to not try to fix those things? And in what way is it wisdom to not try to fix those things? Is this something, and is this something that we just have to go through? Is it really just like, are we really just in the Kali Yuga and we just have to let it ultimately like work itself out? Or are we in the Iron Age?
Well, Barfield would say that.
So,
Barfield would say you have to go through it, right? I mean, we all know that you can't go back, right? And you
right.
shouldn't project yourself into the future, because
There's,
then you
this is
you
important,
cause
like, right,
yourself too
which
much
means that,
anxiety. You don't know.
right, for this, right, which means there's no bringing the actual literal emperor of Christendom. We can't bring him back. And we see what the people who've tried to do it, what that has led to. Because that is like, as Tomberg points out in this chapter, that was the project of Napoleon. That was the project of Hitler. You can't do it by the sword.
Well, see, that's right, right. And this is why the emperor is in an open space. There's nothing there that he does. There's no past and there's no future. It's only the now. That's where he's sitting. Okay. And so, oh, I had a thought, now I lost it. There are so many examples, and there's so many examples. Alyosha just comes to mind because I've been talking about him, but there's so many examples of letting it be. Okay. Letting it be. And as a form of wisdom, which is what I've been talking about with Luke and Jess, for example. Walking on water is, right? under what the water is under your feet is chaos.
Mm.
It's chaos, and you can transcend it. That's what that's what walking on water is, right? And how do you transcend it? You can only transcend it by letting it be, right? That everything, like Rilke says, the point is to live everything. Tom Bergen here says that to exist, to be, right, is this gift from God. Freedom and existence are synonymous, okay? So, and I've always thought God put us in the garden, and what did he do? He breathed his life into us. That is his gift to us. I think Christians make the mistake, and I'm not saying it isn't, but they make the mistake thinking that God's gift to us is salvation. But God's gift to us is this life, is to be, is our existence. And this is why what Ivan does is blasphemous.
But wait a minute though. Let's talk about salvation for a minute, right? So salvation and redemption are synonymous, right? And what is redemption? Redemption is the freedom is the freeing up from slavery.
Yeah.
So freedom is the gift. And ultimately freedom and salvation are the same thing.
Right. Well, I think so.
Your real existential freedom.
Well, I personally believe that as soon as you're born into the world, you are caught up in your salvation. Okay, that's what you're caught up in. You are caught up in redemption itself.
Well, and since God has already accomplished the possibility of your freedom first by withdrawing to create ex nihilo in the first place, and then again by absolving any responsibility that you had for the abuse of your freedom on the cross, then the only thing left for you to do is to accept it.
Right. And then of course, then this gets into all the non-judgment stuff, right? I mean, you have to act in the world. You need to discern, right from wrong, better from best, all, worst case scenarios, all those things. And oftentimes when you're moving and acting in the world and discerning where to go next, you're choosing between two evils, essentially. We always talk about it in terms of pros and cons, right? There's always something wrong with the choice. We're always going to make some kind of compromise when we choose something. We have to make a compromise. That's the limitation that Tom Berg talks about in here, right?
And I think it's this pressure of time that causes us to see things that way. And the more compressed this pressure of time becomes, the more overwhelmed we are.
I think that does play a role, but there's also a space involved in your decision making, because you're going to wonder how do I fit into that scenario, and how does that scenario fit into my life? How much space is it going to take of my life, which includes time, right? Time and space are, I can't think of the physicist at the moment, but he's recent, he's still living, and I've watched talks with him, and he's very interesting because he believes that time is space, which is like really interesting to me. Anyway, like James pointed out in our conversation that, the sign of the cross is time and space, right? Space and time. And we never, at least I never.
The center is where
is the human being.
Is where they cross.
Is the person. Yeah.
I would say that's also the now.
That's also the now. Exactly. That's where the emperor sits. And then you've got the whole heart carrying the head thing, right? I thought of that when James mentioned.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. There's that.
Yeah, the heart carrying the head. Yeah.
But
right. Well, Tom Berg in this chapter talks about like the danger of like of, being too caught up in abstract metaphysics. And he uses Rene Guénon as an example.
He does. Who I've never read. I've heard lots about him, but I've never read him.
You should read him. He's good.
Yeah.
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 Uh, Crisis of the Modern World is probably the best one to start with. Although The Reign of Quantity is also really, really good.
Yeah. I just find it really fascinating for myself personally, because I've been making this thought journey, right? Kind of proceeding into areas that I've always had interests in, but I never had this kind of dialogue with people, or I was never introduced to literature to read or anything. And
It's
I'm
a
finally,
shame. It's a shame that it took this long for that to happen because you're just so good at it. Like you just have you're bright, but then you also just have this kind of openness that we're talking about. This openness for revelation, it just comes so naturally to you
yeah. Well, I
that
mean, if you're the emperor and you're sitting in a clearing and things start walking in to the clearing, they had to get there, you see. Like this is, and I've actually literally had these experiences where I'm sitting in a clearing on my property, and all of a sudden a coyote comes trotting in, and then a wolf, and I'm like, or a bear, or I look up and there's two hawks, um, they're there in the clearing, or they enter the clearing, and they're not magical. They don't just show up. They don't poof out of nowhere. They come to the clearing. So what brought them to these are the questions I'm asking myself. Oh, why did they come to the clearing? Oh, look, he's hunting mice. So now I know that not only does the coyote come to the clearing because their mice are plentiful, but there are actually mice in the clearing.
right,
Everything is connected, I guess, is what I'm saying, right?
right.
And so I see things, they jump up at me from all over, from all parts of the clearing, really. And I try to understand the connection, because the clearing is like the convergence of all those things. Like it's the place where they come together, right? And it's revelation, because if you're in a clearing, what's around the clearing is forest. It's dark, and suddenly something appears out of the darkness. It is a revelation, right? So I understand what he's talking about when he talks about these things. I also really jumped on that when James mentioned it concerning Heidegger's thought, right?
Mhm.
And that's what interested me, specifically what interested me in the process that Dugan is trying to do, whether or not it's right or he's right or anything. I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about that same idea. He's trying to create a space like for the emperor, right? This open clearing, which was also what Heidegger was doing.
Yeah, but where Dugan goes wrong is he thinks he can actually bring back the emperor. He
Right.
believes in the idea of Holy Russia. He hasn't.
Yeah.
It hasn't. It hasn't occurred to him that gateway is closed. We can't
Right.
go
But
back
what's
there.
more fascinating to me is that if anyone thinks about anything for any length of time, they get to the clearing. Okay.
Right.
They're making their way to the clearing.
Yes.
There it is.
Right.
They always
Yeah.
end up in the clearing. And that is
Oh,
really fascinating to me. And then reading it in here was even more fascinating. And then of course, like you were talking about the practices. And I mean, when I read that section, the practices are whose aim is to awaken from sleep, right? Ever
yeah.
deeper layers of consciousness. So it's not like
Think about that. Think about that approach to actually think about how different that approach is to how, and he talks about it in relation to reading not only the book of Revelation, but also to the way that we read the Gospels and also like the Old Testament too, right? So that's not how most of us are reading it. That's just that's
you mean
that
Revelation?
any of the Bible. That's
I
just
mean,
not the approach that's not the approach that most Christians are taking to the scripture at all.
no,
They're not coming to it.
but they have to, that's because they're not in a clearing.
Right,
That's
exactly.
exactly why. You know, like when he talked about the Gospels down here, that's literally, that happened to me. Okay. So I had my daughter. I realized I was going to be a parent. Well, I was pregnant actually. Thought I'm going to be a parent. Oh my God, now what? Right. And I thought, I don't want to read Dr. Spock. I don't want to read other people's ideas. I'm very suspicious. I immediately wanted to go to some kind of mystical text and draw out of it the essence, not any instruction per se. And the only one I was familiar with was the Bible. I wouldn't have called
Well, the
myself a
only way to
Christian.
be a parent is to have authority
Right.
in exactly the way
Right. And
Talberg is
so I
talking
thought,
about.
well, I'm going to read the Bible and just let it speak to me. I'm not going to think about, and I was thinking about parenting. Okay. I wasn't thinking about spirituality or Christianity or my salvation or anything like that.
What's more spiritual than parenting? And then
Right.
that's not a joke.
No, it's true. It's true.
Right.
And so I started in Matthew. And by the time I got to John, I was literally, and this is the only way I can describe it, in love with Jesus. And when he says here, without scrutinizing, right, but as an admirer with ever growing admiration, that's exactly what happened to me, because I wasn't scrutinizing. I was seeking.
Right.
I was in the open space. I was in that open space that the emperor sits in. And I was going,
reading the Gospels in that way is the reason why, like, Christianity never lost its hold on me, like, completely at any point in my life, because that's always the way I read them.
right.
There was always an encounter with with the person of Jesus, like that, it was never just about like figuring out what dogmas can be derived from the text.
Well, I was in the kitchen with
for
Martha
me.
when she was griping and complaining about Mary, she's doing all the work. Like I was there.
Right.
I was,
putting yourself in it. Yeah. Putting yourself in the narrative.
Yeah. And I knew I kind of understood Zacchaeus. Like I was like, oh man, he's just a little guy and nobody ever notices him. Right? They never notice him.
That is not a character I'm able to easily identify with.
Because he's so little and he climbs up into a tree. And what does Jesus do? Exactly the thing that Zacchaeus has never experienced. Yeah. He noticed him.
Right. Right.
He noticed him right away.
Right away.
Yeah. And I just got all these kinds of insights because I was there. And I mean, I love Zacchaeus. I think Zacchaeus trusted himself. He knew himself. Mm-hmm. Even though he was little, it didn't seem to bother him. He was just like, well, screw that. I'm climbing a tree. Right.
Resourceful.
Yeah. But anyway, back to this thing here about practicing. Of course, I couldn't help but think about the Orthodox Church. The key to the apocalypse is to practice it. I mean, the Orthodox Church is modeled after the apocalypse. Okay. You walk into the Revelation, the cosmic liturgy of Revelation. You practice it. Okay. Everything in the church is, I don't know what the 28 exercises are that he's talking about here.
The 4 different cycles of 7.
Okay.
So he's talking about each of those as an exercise.
Right. And so he's saying,
so together they make 28 because of there are 4 cycles of 7.
Right. Okay. But he says you have to establish oneself in a state of consciousness which is suited to receive revelation. Well, that's why you're standing in the apocalypse in the church. You're there to receive revelation from God. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And to establish a state of consciousness. You're standing, your senses are engaged, you're surrounded by the cloud of witnesses. Like you're there, eh? Like it's totally, you're there. And I can tell you, even though I've never been inside of a church, and I say it like I have been, because I actually have been in my mind. Okay. I did matins, and my priest did it in his office. Okay. Like, it wasn't even in the church. He was in his office for all of COVID, and I would do matins on Zoom. But I was there. I was in that place and standing before my icons with my incense going and my candle burning and listening to the words of the liturgy. And I had revelations about the Theotokos that were like just amazing. Amazing.
Mhm.
It was totally a place where, like a clearing, where you could meditate, you could reflect, right? And you I don't know how else to say it. Yeah. Let things reveal themselves to you.
Right.
Yeah. Which is what the Theotokos did.
Right.
It was yeah, it was amazing.
Right.
And that's when I started realizing that what this journey is metanoia. It's a change, it's a state, it's an evolution of consciousness is what it is.
Right.
And like when he talks about the
Discover,
deeper
waking up greater and
Yeah.
greater parts of the consciousness. Yeah.
waken from sleep, ever deeper layers of consciousness. I'm like, that's what it is.
Yeah. And symbols and symbols and arcana are the tools that are used
Right.
for doing that.
Which is why, and I'll just say this again, why
Which he contrasts with like abstract metaphysics. He doesn't say don't do abstract metaphysics at all. He's saying the
No, no.
Hermeticists can do abstract metaphysics. What he's saying is don't let the abstract metaphysics become a replacement for those things, or you won't have depth.
Right. Yeah.
And that was kind of like I was able to identify with that because that's kind of like my, let's say I was raised Pentecostal, and then my first, return to Christianity in my early 20s when I converted to Catholicism, I was operating in this at the level of abstract metaphysics exclusively.
Yeah.
And so I know the drawbacks. And the problem with that is that there is no depth. And because there is no depth, there's a limit to how far it will take you. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah.
So
well, there's also the fact that what you're reading or researching or whatever, listening to, is what has been revealed to someone, but it hasn't been revealed to you. You see,
right. Although it can,
depending on how, if you discourse,
it can actually be revelatory to you depending on how you read it, right? Yeah. So you can actually, like, if you approach, I mean, honestly, this is true with like a whole wide variety of texts, to be honest with you. Like,
yeah,
if you read them and you're in the right frame of, your consciousness is in the right state, you can actually receive revelation from them.
Of course, like no doubt. I mean, you can you do that when you're reading scripture, right?
Right.
And but it's the depths that is the interesting part, because like you've had the experience, I've had the experience of having something revealed, some kind of eureka moment or aha moment.
I think it's universal. I really think it's like, I don't think there's anybody that's alive that's a human being that hasn't had this experience.
No, and
they may not recognize what it is, but it's happened.
And the thing is, it's transformative, right? It takes you down another level of consciousness. And it's that movement that you feel, right? When you say, oh my God, oh, that's a eureka, like, and
well, what the real is, what's the real, what if something is actually a revelation, what's revealed is always the real. Yeah, which is truth, goodness, and beauty. It's one of those three or all of those three. I'm saying
Yeah, if it's
they're
all those
all
three, then
ultimately
you're
the
pretty
same
desperate for
anyway.
faith.
They come together in God. But that's what Revelation is of.
Yeah. Yeah. But you can't, my point was that you cannot take the listener down to those depths. That's a movement within your own consciousness, right?
Right.
And so all you can do is hope that as they scratch the surface of your lake, your body of water, that they actually, they plunge into the depths at this, like you did. That's all you can hope for, right?
Right.
And that's the beauty of language and communication,
Well,
like that we give each other that opportunity, right?
like my second go around, what happened with me is that I opened myself to imagination and to being led by imagination and beauty.
Yeah.
That was the difference.
Yeah.
And not by just abstract intellection. And I think that there's a tendency, the reason why this getting caught up in the abstract intellection, like to neglecting these other things, the reason why there's danger in that pathway is that it comes back to being a species of this idolatry of power, right? Because this is something that if you have a powerful intellect and you can do it really well, it gives you power.
Yeah.
And it actually you're subjecting God to your control in a way. Because it's like,
Well,
oh, I
that's,
have the right abstract ideas about God, and your abstract ideas about God are different from my abstract ideas about God. And I have the power because of my intellect and my ability and my argumentative skill that I can prove that my abstract ideas about God are better than yours. But the thing is that neither my abstract ideas about God, your abstract ideas about God have any direct connection to the living God.
right. Well, this is why I say we're all heretics, right? Because we all have ideas about God.
Right. In as much as they're just ideas and not experience,
Yeah.
right? This is like Carl Rahner is saying that, like, I don't remember the exact quote, but effectively what he said is that Christianity in the future will be mystical or not at all.
Right. Yeah.
So
Well, there's that final little bit from the Tao Te Ching where he says, therefore the sage keeps to one and becomes the standard for the world. He does not display himself, therefore he shines. He does not approve himself, therefore he is noted. He does not praise himself, therefore he has merit. He does not glory in himself, therefore he excels. And because he does, this is the best part. And because he does not compete, therefore no one in the world can compete with him. I love that. Right. And all the things that he talks about beforehand, like competition, self-praise, self-approval, those are the things that are grasping for power, right?
right.
So,
And ultimately he lays down his life so that he can live.
yeah.
Not the life that he's imagined for himself,
Well, he's nobody.
but
He's nothing.
right.
But he's everything, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly the description that Tomber makes of the Hermeticist in the earlier
Right.
chapters. He
Right.
makes that same description that he's just nothing, but
Right.
he's everything. Yeah.
Right. Right.
It's really interesting.
Yep. All right. Well, is there anything else that you from the chapter that we wanted to touch on before we wrap up here?
So let me just have a quick
Let's
look.
see. Oh, there's one. Let's see. This is because it talks about the becoming truly human here. So this is toward the very end, I think.
Yeah, I have it underlined.
Oh yeah. This is actually the very okay. So I'm just gonna read like the closing last bit of the chapter because I think this is a good note to end on. Practical Hermeticism is alchemy. The ideal of Hermeticism is essentially and fundamentally the alchemical ideal. This means to say, the more one becomes truly human, the more one manifests the divine element underlying human nature, which is the image and likeness of
Yeah.
God. The ideal of abstraction invites human beings to do away with human nature, to dehumanize. This is exactly what I was just talking about.
Yes, but you're
In
saying,
contrast, the ideal of alchemical transformation of Hermeticism offers to human beings the way to the realization of true human nature, which is the image and likeness of God. Hermeticism is the rehumanization of all elements of human nature. It is their return to their true essence. Just as all base metal can be transformed into silver and into gold, so are all the forces of human nature susceptible to transformation into silver and gold, i.e., to what they are when they share in the image and likeness of God. But in order to re-become what they are in their essence, they must be submitted to the operation of sublimation. Now,
mhm,
this operation is crucifying for that which is base amongst them, and at the same time, it is the blossoming of what is their true essence. The
mhm,
cross and the rose. The rose cross is the symbol of this operation and of the realization of the truly human man. Thus, the emperor of the tarot renounces the four arbitrary liberties of human nature. He is, in this sense, crucified, and as the real symbol of the emptiness which is established because of renunciation, is the wound, one can say, of the emperor who has four wounds. It is by these four wounds that the manifestation of the divine image and likeness of human nature is accomplished in him. The divine in human nature. And what of the divine which transcends it? In order for the latter to manifest, it is necessary to have one wound more. It is necessary to have five wounds. Now it is the following card, the Pope, which will teach us the arcanum of the manifestation of the divine transcending human nature by means of the fine wounds.
mhm. There's the second chapter that you read. But in order to re-become what they are in their essence, they must be submitted to the operation of sublimation. I mean, that's what I was talking about when I said, as soon as you're born into the world, you are caught up in the story of redemption,
Mm-hmm.
re-becoming.
Yeah.
And there was just one other thing here. I
Well,
like
that's the cycle. Like you can see this, like this ties to like the cycles of life too, right?
Mhm.
Like to become like to the like to when you enter into the stage of life where you become the sage, you're actually re-becoming what you were as a child, but in a greater way because you have all of the knowledge that and wisdom that you gained along the way that you didn't
Well, it's
have.
not a re-becoming in being what you were in the past, but it's an integration of
Right, right,
what
right.
you are now.
But the essence of what you are is connected to what you were in the
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah. This is a nice little thing here. For the Hermetic philosophical sense has more in common with the plain and sincere faith of simple people. I totally relate to this.
Yeah, right.
Then abstract metaphysics has, you talked about this too. For the common believer, God lives. Likewise, for the Hermeticist, the believer addresses himself to saints and angels. For the Hermeticist, they are real. The believer believes in miracles. The Hermeticist lives in the presence of miracles. The believer prays for the living and the dead. The Hermeticist dedicates all his efforts in the domain of sacred magic to the good of the living and the dead. The believer esteems all that which is traditional. The Hermeticist does likewise. What more is there to say? Perhaps that the emperor owes his authority not to his power, visible or invisible, over human beings, but rather because he represents them before God. He has authority not because he is superhuman, but rather because he is very human, because he represents all that which is human. King David was more human than all men of his time, which I loved. I underline that because I
Mhm,
love King David for that reason.
mhm.
I do.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll wrap that up, and next time will be letter 5 on the Pope, which we got a little bit of a taste of what that's going to be dealing with at the end of the last bit that we read. So that's going to be related to the 5 wounds. So that should be interesting. It's
Yes.
obviously that's going to connect to the 5 wounds of Christ. So
Yeah.
that should be great. Hopefully, Michael and
Yep.
Judd will be able to join us next time. But it was a great pleasure to to have just the two of us on
It
this
was
time. It was a
nice.
nice
It was
change of
really great.
pace.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it.
me too.
Yep. Thank you for joining me, Sherry.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nate, for doing
Even
this.
when our other friends had abandoned us. That was great. I think it was a great conversation. Thank you
Yeah, it
very
was
much.
good.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.